This is Valley News Live at 10.
What would your message be specifically to people who say that downtown isn't safe?
Well, that's a good question.
Today, Valley News Live asked Fargo Police about safety downtown after a homeless man stabbed two people at the Pride Parade this past weekend and hit a third person with a knife. Thanks for joining us at 10. I'm Stacey Van Dyke.
And I'm Justin Betty. Homelessness has been a hot topic for the city a lot lately, looking for ways to prevent people from having to sleep outside, as well as keeping people on streets and trails near downtown safe.
In this latest situation, police say they were monitoring the event with drones in the sky and a nearby crime center staffed with people monitoring cameras, but they didn't offer any specifics into more or different safety plans for future large events.
Instead, they doubled down, saying what they have been saying, that downtown is safe. Valley News Team's Anna Ballweber has more in this VNL investigation.
Our downtown is very safe.
Street fairs, farmers markets, and parades are just some of the several events downtown Fargo hosts year-round. And as fun as these events are, crime can find its way here.
There certainly are things that can happen to anybody, but the best advice I can give is be aware of your surroundings.
Aware of her surroundings during the Fargo Moorhead Pride Parade, a woman saw two men fighting, tried to stop it, and was stabbed along with two others.
I would advise people to probably not intervene.
Her attacker was homeless and faces 2 counts of attempted murder. Downtown homelessness has been a topic of city discussion for months. In terms of crime downtown, he tells us it's coming from everyone.
I mean, there's violent crimes from people that aren't homeless just as much as there are from people that are. Certainly there's homeless people that hang out downtown that we contact on a regular basis. A lot of them don't cause any issues. Some of them certainly do, but we could say that about people that do have homes to live in too.
The captain says those violent crimes in other areas of Fargo don't seem to get as much attention as the ones downtown.
But there's certainly violent crime that happens in other parts of the city as well, but it certainly kind of seems like that doesn't get covered by the media as much as the downtown stuff.
Still, police say they're working to make downtown safer. In Fargo, Anna Ballweber, Valley News Live.
Tonight, Valley News Live is also learning more about the suspect in that latest downtown stabbing.
Yeah, we have found a YouTube page that appears to belong to Michael Hurto. In one of the videos on that page, she appears to be inside the downtown library talking about being sexually assaulted by a group of people. This is before the stabbing, obviously. He also appears filming other homeless people in downtown Fargo in the videos. We asked police if they are aware of this video or of this page. They would only say that they're still investigating.
New developments